In the name of the one and only, we are beginning another session of the Indigo Firmament. In the previous one, we had discussion around the concept of the perception of Islam throughout history. Islam as a civilization, Islam as a culture, Islam as a religion, Islam as a personal identity. But we are concerned primarily with its overall perception in the context of whether it is perceived in a positive light or is it seen as a negative phenomenon. This perception in the positive or in the negative is generally viewed from a European perspective, which is one perspective. And because of it, unfortunately, we often ignore the perception of Islam in other societies or in other regions of the world. So today we are going to turn our focus to the East. And again, we are trying to cover most of the half a millennia that ends in the year 1500 or thereabouts. We talked about the period up to the 1500s in the western part of the Muslim world, but we haven't talked about the East, which is often ignored and forgotten. So we will probably discuss the Indian subcontinent in the first session, and we'll see whether we are able to cover most of it or not. And then we can subsequently discuss China as well. Islam in India, from its inception in the year 711, when Muhammad bin Qasim, the Arab commander, went to send, in a way, India was introduced to Islam as much as Islam was introduced to India. This encounter was more cultural, and it was enlightening for both sides, that in spite of the fact that India, the Indian subcontinent and the Arabian Peninsula are kind of appendices, if you visualize it in terms of their geographic layout, they are appendices to the Asian continent, and they are pretty close to each other. But perhaps the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf had remained kind of the barrier for these two cultures not to have any, or not to have much connection. So that first incursion into the Indian subcontinent by the Muslims was, for lack of a better term, an introductory one. They learned enough about each other, and the interesting factor here is that when Muhammad bin Qasim understood the principles of Hinduism as a religion and realized that in essence they do worship one God through many manifestations, his idea or his perception of Hinduism changed completely. So he wrote back to Baghdad and to Damascus, primarily to Damascus. He wrote back and asked for a clarification that if the Quran is accepting the notion of monotheism, in other words, the absolute oneness of the divine, and that those who adhere to this principle have to be understood as Ahlul Kitab, the people of the earlier revelations. And I must clarify that here, Kitab does not refer to a book or a written scripture, but rather to the message that binds a certain community within the concept of unicity, oneness, totality of the divine being, comprehensively one and only one. This is the concept of the absolute monotheism. However, the term Ahlul Kitab was misunderstood and misinterpreted, that the word Kitab was translated as a book, and therefore the people of the book were perceived to be Jews and Christians, whereas the Quran mentions the Sabi'in as well. And if we look at the religious evolution, the evolution of monotheism in the general regional context, you cannot exclude Zoroastrianism from this either. So this was the extent of it, of what was considered the realm within. When Muslims went to India and found out that Hinduism too, in that sense, is monotheistic, that in the totality they believe in one single God, however its manifestations are many, and from the outside view Hindus are seen as polytheistic, as the various gods have been humanized or humanified, as they have been given personalities, and these personalities are perceived to be independent divine entities, whereas the understanding of at least Muhammad bin Qasim was that no, that in essence they do believe in one God, and these are mere manifestations in multiplicity. So he asked the government in Damascus whether the concept of Ahlul Kitab should be extended to the Hindus as well. And the response came in the affirmative. And therefore, from the beginning, Hindus were perceived to be monotheistic. But of course, this did not remain so for the rest of the, what we can call, for lack of a better term, the encounter between Muslims and Hindus in the Indian subcontinent. And soon we had, while there must have been some small minority communities of Muslims in India, India remained largely a Hindu, Jainist, Buddhist domain, geographically speaking. Then came the invasions from the north. And as we have talked about this in some of the earlier programs that may or may not have been in English, that the pattern of invasion from the north is kind of a counterclock movement, which can be seen as from an imaginary zero point, from a center that would be perhaps in the northern Himalayas, so that the people of Asia moved west, and by Asia I mean Mongolia and its vicinity, that they moved west and then they moved south, and then further they moved southeast. So in that sweep of, again, if you can imagine the hand of a clock, that turns backwards. It moves from Mongolia to Central Asia to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then subsequently into India. This was the migration pattern, sometimes the result of climatic changes, sometimes the result of invasions and plunder of resources, as northern Asia was for various reasons not as resourceful in terms of natural resources. So the people had to migrate. They had to, at times, come in contact with other societies and who would have laid claim to their own natural resources, and the result would have been then wars and invasions and encounters and all that. It's here, although I would like to discuss the concept of the warrior culture later. But in respect to India, suffice it to say that these were warrior cultures of primarily Turco-Altaic and later on blending with certain Aryanic people who brought to India, among other things, Islam as a religion. But this was not necessarily an invasion of India for the sake of Islam or representing Islam. Rather, their own primary interests were reaching the natural resources, just like Europeans in the age of discovery went around the world to conquer and colonize and rob other continents. This wasn't just the exclusive domain of the Europeans. Asians did that as well, but Asians from northern Asia, where there was shortage of resources. So we had, I think if we take the historical analysis, kind of confine it to a certain period, because we can't talk in generalities without referring to specificities. I would say the formation of the Delhi Sultanate, or Padshahi Delhi, that would be the formative period. And this begins roughly in the year 1206, with its capital in Delhi, when these northern tribes move south. But it's important to note that there was a prelude to this, and the prelude would be the Ghaznavi incursions into the Indian subcontinent that started in the year 963 up to the year 1186. That would be the duration of the Ghaznavi Empire, and then the Seljuks had their share of these from 1037 to 1194. And in some ways you could also add the Khwarazm Shahi incursions from 1077 to 1231. So these waves of incursions and invasions from the north created a clash of cultures. Now, since we are talking about the perception of Islam, then this encounter had to be defined in a polarity of Islam and Hinduism. So obviously, from the Hindu perspective, Islam would have had a very, very negative perception. They were the invaders, they were the northerners, they were coming and looting and destroying their temples, they were, taking over their lands. So that would have been very negative, to put it mildly, from the Hindu perspective. From the Muslim perspective, at least in the context of the Turco-Altaic cultural setting of the Turkic tribes that moved from Central Asia, who would have been shamanistic in terms of their own belief system only a few decades and centuries ago, who had now become Muslims themselves, and put their own new belief system as the main force, the very thrust of their incursions, and use that as a medium to manipulate public minds towards the justification of these incursions into the Indian subcontinent. So they would have looked at Mahmud Ghaznavi as a great, not just as a great war hero, not just as a great warrior, but also as someone who served Islam, because he went and destroyed Hindu temples. He brought, for example, the gate of Somanat back with him to Ghazni, which again, we can glorify it all we want, but if you look at it from a humanistic perspective, this amounted to nothing but invasions, incursions, and looting. Perhaps the only reason that many Muslims, especially in Afghanistan and Central Asia, who do not see it that way is because the public perception, the mindset, was manipulated in the name of religion. Now imagine if the situation had been the other way around. If the Hindus had come and destroyed the Muslim mosques in Afghanistan and what is today Pakistan, if they had taken the gates of the mosques and taken them back with them to India, then that same argument could not be made and could not have been made. So, yes, the name of God and Islam and religion and Quran and all that was used, but the incursions were primarily political and to some extent economical. So in places like Afghanistan, again due to environmental circumstance, the shortage of natural resources, it made it very difficult for any empire to expand within its border and not step into the domain of the Indian subcontinent. You could have raised huge armies, but you could not sustain them for long because the natural resources, the shortage of the natural resources would not make it possible. This became even more so after the Mongol invasion of Genghis Khan or Genghis Khan, who messed up and destroyed the whole economic and agricultural infrastructure of the region. And therefore, that invasion, that destruction and demise resulted in the furtherance of the shortages of natural resources. And resuscitating that would have been difficult. But again, to look at it with a sense of what is available around, in the incursions to India would have been a rather easier option. So we have the Ghaznavids that went to India, and that those clashes. I think Mahmud went to India about 17 times. There were 17 incursions that occurred between the 33 years of his rule in Ghazni. One other factor that is relevant here is the fact that the majority of the soldiers of the Ghaznavid Empire were primarily not Turkic, but Aryanic, and primarily the Pashtuns. And the Pashtuns who lived in the central highlands of Afghanistan, I'm talking in times of peace, and the central part of Afghanistan, what is Hazarajat and Ghurian, which was later Arabized into Ghurat and all that. This region was again had scarce resources. So the Pashtuns of central Afghanistan, out of that environmental necessity, had to go to have seasonal migration to India. So these Pashtuns would be going from Hazarajat to, say, the vicinities of Delhi, and they would spend summers in one area and winters in another. In other words, central Afghanistan was not only suffering from scarce natural resources, but also the season was very short. They had long winters, during which time you couldn't really do much in terms of agriculture. So if they couldn't raise crops, grow crops, then they had to raise animals, because animals can move with seasons, whereas crops remain there. So because of that, in winters they went south to India, northern India, and in the summer they went back to what is central Afghanistan today. Now, the relevance of that to the argument we have is that a large number of the Pashtuns were part of the armed forces of Mahmud of Ghazni. And his concern was that at times he wasn't sure that these large groups of Pashtuns that did their seasonal migration to India, and while they were in Ghazni or in what is modern Afghanistan, they would have pledged their loyalty to the Ghaznavid government. But he was concerned that if they go south to India, that there was a possibility of either a resurrection because they had large numbers, or that they could come back from India with their own leader, political leadership and all that, and declare themselves independent and therefore pose a threat to the Ghaznavi government in Ghazni, of course. So for this reason, he sometimes used this migratory pattern, which was, like I said, a seasonal thing. So when Mahmud was uncertain, he wanted to accompany these Pashtuns south to India. And this way he could observe them close up and watch them and supervise them and make sure that there wasn't any disloyalty developing against the Ghaznavids. And so when we are talking about the 17 incursions into India, this is the political side of it, which is often forgotten and neglected. Like I said, so seasonal migration had something to do with it. Shortage of natural resources was another factor. And of course, quote unquote, the spreading of Islam as a mission of the Ghaznavids, which could cover the other two reasons and which could enable and help them manipulate the mindset of the large masses and these would have been Pashtuns as well as non-Pashtuns and other regional forces of the tribal society that existed at the turn of the millennia. So we start with the Ghaznavids, and that would have really intensified the tension between the Hindus and the Muslims, and the perception of Islam would very certainly have been very, very negative, and there would have been plenty of antagonism, plenty of resentment, and all that. However, in the course of the time subsequent to the Ghaznavi period, we have the Ghurids who kind of step into the vacuum. The Ghaznavids are just like the regular migration pattern that was moving in that counterclock form. The Ghaznavid were pushed out of Ghazni. They moved their capital to Lahore, which is in modern Pakistan. And the Ghurids took over Ghazni, and then subsequently they went and pushed the Ghaznavids even further south. And the Ghurids then took over most of northern India. In this pattern of political convenience for the Ghaznavids, natural migration patterns of the majority of the people who formed the backbone of their armies, and the regular seasonal migration of the majority of this majority that were Pashtuns that oscillated between central Afghanistan and northern India every year, all contributed to that first period. So if we can then encapsulate this, we had the Ghaznavids who, like I said, went first into India from the north. Then the formation of what we know as the Delhi Sultanate was that at this point, especially with the Ghurids, they realized that if instead of going to India for, say, booty and plunder, why not stay there? And by then, obviously, they had weakened many of the Hindu kingdoms of northern India, and they were powerful enough to establish themselves instead as the rulers of the various regions. We have in this period there are 5 dynasties that contributed to the formation of the Delhi Sultanate, and these would be primarily either of Turkic or of Pashtun Afghan lineage. And as I said earlier, that the warrior culture was perhaps primarily a Turco-Mongolian mindset, and since the Pashtuns were the majority of the population in what is now modern Afghanistan and perhaps parts of Iran and some of the Central Asian republics as well as Pakistan, therefore they could not be ignored. So they were incorporated, coerced, invited, whatever term that might be applicable here. And also the Pashtuns would also, with such a large number, of necessity had to resist too, to resist the Turco-Mongolian invasions from the north, and then would have subsequently been kind of brought into the fold. So the 5 dynasties in Delhi, and of course we are leaving Afghanistan for now, we will get to that discussion later. So the 5 dynasties of the Delhi Sultanate were primarily a mixture of Pashtun and Turkic dynasties. To give you a map of, and that's a historical timeline map. We are moving now from 1206 all the way to the 1500, which is 1526. This is the period of the Delhi Sultanate. Now notice that it's during this period that the Mongols under Genghis Khan, Chengiz Khan, invade Central Asia and Afghanistan and the whole region. Now, they took over China and vast areas of the Asian continent. The one region they could not reach, and this is often ignored, the one region they could not reach was India. It was in India where these Pashtun and Turkic dynasties of the Delhi Sultanate were able to ward off the incursions of the Mongols under Chengiz Khan. And that is pretty significant because in a sense, one warrior culture meets another. And it's significant in that sense. Now, the first 5 of these dynasties, or all of these 5 dynasties, would be what is called the Mamluk dynasty, that starts in 1206. And let me explain the Mamluk part. The concept of slavery. Unfortunately, we have one single word, but it does not mean the same thing to every culture. We have the slavery of the plantation in the Americas, which was bringing slaves from Africa to work in the plantations to produce for an economic system. We probably have, I'm sure we have discussed this, if not in this program, elsewhere. That is this general perception of slavery in the West. There is another kind of slavery where individual people were enslaved for labor, especially in battles. The losing side, instead of having prisoners of war, which was kind of the great achievement of the Geneva Conventions in the 20th century, that people realized that finally we have become civilized enough that people who engage in war and lose should be treated with dignity, something that was completely ignored after 9/11 by the Bushites and the neocons. Nonetheless, that is a rather new concept. The ancient concept was that if 2 armies tangled, the men and sometimes the women of the losing side would be enslaved, and these would become personal slaves to the winning side, in which individual commanders and soldiers, as well as the state apparatus, would participate in this exploitation of the humans. So that's a different kind of slavery. There's a third kind of slavery which is not understood in the West. And that slavery is not an exploitative slavery, but rather one of 2 individuals entering into a contract of loyalty towards one another. And so when one enters that kind of a contract of loyalty and faithfulness to one another, it is a kind of adopting one another, like we adopt children here in the West. In the East, they adopted grown-ups. Usually, the rulers, kings and emperors, would adopt some of their generals and higher-ups in the social and military hierarchy as their slaves. or certain generals and rulers and significant ones in that social hierarchy would themselves swear loyalty to their emperors and kings. And so when this would happen, a social bond would be created. Now, again, like I said earlier, this bondage, this affinity, this affiliation, this social contract between two individuals was called the institution of ghulam, but not barda. Those two words are not just because they come from different languages, but they connote different things. Bardagi, which is a Persian term, refer to the economic exploitation of one vulnerable, generally from the south, often from the African continent, but also from the region. That people will be enslaved for labor. That's bardagi, that's different. But unfortunately, in the common parlance, the term barda and ghulam are used interchangeably. And in English, they are both translated as slave, which is again incorrect. But in the regional context, ghulam is not the same as barda. Ghulam is the person who swears, takes an oath of loyalty to another individual. Now, I'm sure that there were ghulams at the lower level of the society of whom we never knew anything. They do not appear on too many people's radar when they study history. But the higher ups would have more visibility. And it's in this context that to take, for example, during the reign of the Samanids of Balkh, when there are certain courageous, skillful warriors of Turkic origin that came into the Samanid realm of influence, since they were not Aryan, they were not of, say, the royal family or the ruling class, then they had to be somehow brought into the realm. In other words, they had to be incorporated into the system. And it's in this case where this becomes more visible, that a man, for instance, by the name of Alptekin, a Turkish warrior who is liked by the Samanids, he becomes their ghulam, not their slave, but their adopted general, their socially contracted own, the one who's brought into the realm. And when that loyalty is established, Alptekin and then subsequently his son-in-law, Subuktekin, who happens to be the father of Mahmud of Ghazni, these were the slaves, and again I'm using the word in that particular historical context and in that particular cultural context, that these were not slaves as economic slaves, but rather people who had entered a social contract of loyalty and who had been adopted. And the reason is that when the Samanids realized that they needed a governor further south in Ghazni, they sent none other but Alptekin. You don't send a slave to become a governor. And that's the distinction we have to make. That Alptekin was not a slave the way it's understood in the West. He was not a barda the way that term is connoted by the Persian word slave, but rather a ghulam. And the result was that subsequently, the second, third generation, these ghulams became independent themselves and established their own state. So the early Ghaznavids would have been, again, we call them Ghaznavi with the assumption that they were people from Ghazni, but they were not. These were Turkic generals who came from Central Asia in the service of the Samanids, who appointed them as governors of Ghazni, who later on declared their own independent state. At the same time, we had this similar development that occurred in other parts of the world. Among them, in India, where we have the period of what is known as the Ghulam Shahi, and that term by itself seems paradoxical. Ghulam is, again, a loose translation, loosely translated as slave. Shah would be translated as a king. The kings, the slave kings of India, which is not only ridiculous and paradoxical, but it's because the words are not translated correctly. The Arabic term for that would be mamluk, owned, and here again we are talking about the ownership of loyalty, not the ownership of the human soul and the human body for enslavement, for economic exploitation. So we have the Ghulam Shahi of India, we have the Mamluks of India, we have the Mamluks of Egypt. So pretty much throughout the entire Muslim lands, or Muslim, it may not have been Muslim majorities at that time, but in what is known today as the Muslim lands, there was the spirit where they had these quote-unquote slave kings. And so among these slave kings were also the, like I said, the Ghaznavids had risen to their own they have become the pivotal in the formation of their own government, so they didn't consider themselves slaves or ghulams anymore. In fact, they became more a competition for the Samanids up north in Balkh. We have then the Mamluk dynasty. We have the Khalji dynasty, or the Gharzi dynasty. We have the Tughlaq dynasty, and then we have the later dynasties that subsequently added the Sayyids, and after the Sayyids we had the Lodis, and then we had the Suris. So like I said, most of these, to explain them in terms of their ethnic makeup, would have been either Turkic or Aryans, Afghans, or Pashtuns. And as we have discussed in some of our earlier conversations, that there was a kind of an honored code of dividing responsibilities that Asia, and here we mean Western Asia, was there was a kind of a division of labor and responsibility, that the rulership primarily, after the early Arab invasion, of course, the rulership was primarily the domain of the Pashtuns and the Turks. The administration and court language was primarily that of the Persianates, let's call it that, so that the term Dari and Farsi could be understood in their own context, that when we speak about Persian here, we are not talking about Pahlavi, which was one of the languages that disappeared with the Arab invasion, and that of course is a whole other discussion from a linguistic perspective, but that the new court language that is understood to be that was called Dari, and for lack of a better term, it was popularized by the Arabs as Persian, and so we often refer to it as Farsi Dari. This Dari is the language of the court. That was the language of every court east of the Euphrates, and in fact also in Anatolia. And then the legal system, the jurisprudence, matters of faith and religion, those will be the domain of the Arabs. In other words, the book of the Arabs, the pen of the Persianates, and the sword of the Pashtuns and the Turks were the main divisions within Western Asia. Now, the reference that I made to India in this case is falling exactly within that realm, that the dynasties were primarily Pashtuns or Turkic. The court language in the early Khilji period was called Hindawi, and Hindawi was in kind of a combination, or rather the forerunner of what became Urdu later during the Mughal period. And so the Hindawi would have been kind of Indic, kind of an Indic mixture of the Indian languages that were accepted in the court, and then subsequently they were infused with the Farsi Dari as well as Punjabi and Arabic words, again based on those divisions that I talked about. And so during the Mughal period it became known as the Urdu language, which is going through its own phases now. We will discuss that a little bit later. And of course then the religion of the state would have also been Islam, or at least the states championed the cause of Islam, the expansion of Islam, the spreading of Islam, the conversions of the local people into Islam, and of course the encouragement of it and all that. So this is what kind of characterizes the Delhi Sultanate. From its inception, we are going to the Muhammad Ghori, who would have come from Ghor in central Afghanistan, and most likely Pashtuns, but perhaps mixed with the Turkic tribes as they did intermarry. And he had his own ghulam, or slave, and again with the understanding that I mentioned earlier, who was Qutbuddin Aybak. So Qutbuddin Aybak will be the first slave king of the Sultanate of Delhi, and he conquers large areas of northern India, and afterwards comes the Khilji dynasty, and Khilji would also be, in my estimation, most likely Pashtuns. The word will be derived, now we are speaking derivationally, phonetically, and linguistically. The word Ghar means mountain in Pashto, and Ghor is a variation of Ghar, implying the mountain people, contrasting them with the people of the plains, which are often referred to as the Loy Pashtunkhwa. So the Loy Pashtunkhwa would be the people of the plains, and the people of the mountains will be called the people of Ghar or Ghor or Ghorian. And there are variations, other phonetic variations of that. The word Khilji also is the word Gharzi. Again, Ghar meaning mountain. Gharzai is the one who's born in the mountains or from the mountains. So Gharzai would be Kohzada in Farsi Dari, for those of us, and I'm sure there are many among our audience who understand it that way. So Kohzada will become either Ghor, Ghori, or it will become Ghar, Gharzi. And the word Gharzi has this the phoneme that is between D and Z, which is then simplified from gherzi to gherzi, and then the Z is switched to J. As in many other words, for instance, in Tazik to Tajik, the Z changes to J, and in Gherzi to Gherji, and again the Z sound changes to G. We are much into the phonology here, but because of that necessity. And then the R switches to L, and that's pretty common. We hear it often in Chinese and Japanese that the sounds of R and L are switched, but that's not an anomaly. It's pretty common. So that's when the Gharji eventually becomes Ghalji and Khalji, and Khe being a close consonant to the Gh sound. And after the Khaljis dynasty that come to power, after the Ghurids, they conquer most of the central India. In other words, they expand further south. I believe we are coming to the end of the hour, so I will take a short break here. But in the next session, we are going to continue this discussion into the perception of Islam in the world, and with the concentration on India, and in the period before the 1500s. We started with the Sultanate of Delhi, and we will continue from that point on after this break, or rather in the next session of the Indigo Firmament. For now, we bid you farewell.